We're so glad to have you all with us here tonight. My name is Jess Keating, and I'm the director of the Notre Dame Office of Life and Human Dignity in the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to the second session in our fall webinar series, Conversations That Matter, the Intersection of Justice and Pregnancy. Our hope is that each semester we can gather to reflect on timely issues of importance that really get at the heart of human dignity, and that this series would be an opportunity to commit ourselves to building a culture of life, a culture that recognizes, protects, and promotes the flourishing of every human being. Few issues, I think, in our contemporary culture are as contentious as the issue of abortion. Yet, as the recent study that the McGrath Institute released this summer revealed, for the vast majority of Americans, views about abortion are very complicated. Yet, without fail, those who were interviewed expressed deep appreciation for the opportunity to discuss the complex issues surrounding abortion and the importance of building a society that supports pregnant mothers and their children. And so, in conversation with our partners around the country and guided by the conviction of the inestimable worth of every human life and a commitment to building a civilization of love, we decided to convene a series of conversations focusing on the intersection of justice and pregnancy. In our first session, we explored the largely forgotten history of the pro-life movement before Roe v. Wade as emerging out of the human rights tradition, and with a particular focus on justice for women and the human rights of unborn children. If you missed that first session, you can access the recording at mcgrath.nd.edu/conversations. In tonight's session, we'll pivot and explore the social realities that influence women's decision-making during pregnancy, and explore the potential cultural, legal, and policy-based responses. We think this is important, especially since our study revealed that for many Americans, questions about abortion are intimately tied to questions about support for women and for families. To help us engage these questions, we've invited Ms. Erica Bakayaki to speak with us this evening. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Erica Bakayaki. Ms. Bakayaki is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute, where she founded and directs the Wollstonecraft Project. A graduate of Middlebury College with graduate degrees from Boston College and Boston University School of Law, Ms. Bakayaki was a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School in 2018 and 2019. Her publications include Women, Sex, and the Church, A Case for Catholic Teaching and the Cost of Choice, Women Evaluate the Impact of Abortion from Oxford University Press, and her newest book, The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision, will be published by Notre Dame Press in 2021. In addition to being a scholar, Ms. Bakayaki is also the co-founder of St. Benedict Classical Academy and the mother of 7. Without further ado, Erica Bakayaki.
Thank you so much, Jess. It's really wonderful to be with you all tonight, and I thank the McGrath Institute for having me. So as she mentioned, Jess asked me to talk with you tonight about the social and cultural realities that influence women's decisions to seek abortions. So rather than take a broad look at different reasons women give for obtaining abortions, which you can access, with a quick internet search, I want to instead do a deep dive into the background cultural situation that women find themselves in today. And I want to look in particular at the vast majority of women who obtain abortions. That is the poor and the very poor. But before I get into my own analysis of the issue, an issue that is, of course, very, very complex, I think it's really important to acknowledge from the outset a basic reality about the pro-life movement today that tends to be overlooked, especially as vitriolic national politics tends to these days take over all else, especially on this issue. And as the media tends to perpetuate the narrative that pro-lifers are really just pro-birth. If you step back from the politics, which I'm certainly not here to defend, and look at the pro-life work taking place at the grassroots around our nation, that oft-repeated claim is simply false. There are more than 400 maternity homes and 2,700 crisis pregnancy centers in our country, with the latter serving 2 million people, for instance, in 2017. And this, of course, doesn't count the vast number of adoptive and foster parents and those who volunteer their time in poverty relief and social justice efforts of all sorts. This is truly the unsung work at the very heart of the pro-life movement, and I am confident with this rising generation of really engaged young people that will see this essential work continue to grow. As important as this work is, I do believe it is the most important work the pro-life movement does. I think the social and cultural realities that influence women's decisions to abort are far more complex than this graph up on the screen would lead us to believe. Poverty is surely the proximate cause, we might say, of many, many abortions. And so the pro-life movement is right to focus on support for poor women, especially. But there is much behind the poverty, and I want to try to get at that tonight. Again, this is a deeply complex issue, as there are many intersecting causes of poverty, so I certainly won't claim to bring anything approaching perfect clarity to the issue. But I do want to try to shed light on a particular aspect of the problem that I don't think gets the attention it deserves. Now, people on both sides of the abortion debate rightly argue that women would not need to access abortion so frequently were the lives of the poor and marginalized attended to in our politics as much as the powerful and the privileged. Were our society more hospitable to children, our workplaces more accommodating of caregiving, our housing and healthcare system more affordable, and access to a good education and dignified work not so dependent on zip code, or I should say, many people on both the pro-life and pro-choice sides argue that, not all, of course. But with all of this, I very, very much agree and have written quite a bit about all of this. But these arguments on their own, especially when couched within a general defense of the current abortion legal regime, tend to neglect an important reality about the pedagogical nature of the law. A well-known reality to classical jurists and philosophers, but one that's widely neglected today. And that is that the law shapes a culture, explicitly teaching not only the goods to be pursued and the evils to avoid, but even more subtly, the law creates incentives and disincentives to action, channeling individuals to behave in certain ways. This is, of course, why we work to change laws in the realm of criminal justice, the environment, abuse of children, and the like. We know intuitively that law channels behavior, nudging people to toward better decisions, as two law scholars on the left put it in a recent book. And this is why we work to convince our fellow Americans of this or that this or that law would be more just than another. As my mentor, Harvard Law professor Marianne Glendon often says, she is a student of Tocqueville, who's up on the screen here, sort of positing this approach, and of course, the great ancient jurist and philosopher Cicero. She says, law tells a story about the kind of people we want to be. So what I want to suggest tonight is that our current legal regime, one that treats the private killing of the most vulnerable and defenseless human beings as a constitutional right, a right that according to controlling case law, which I'm going to put up here on the screen, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, women rely upon both to, quote, control their reproductive lives and to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation. So I want to argue that this legal regime has itself contributed to our country's characteristic inhospitality to caregiving, and that this in turn has made the situation of poor women and children particularly acute in our day. So in a word, when abortion is constitutionally protected and in some jurisdictions free of charge, as it has been in our country for nearly 50 years, that reality shapes individual and institutional behavior. So I'm going to talk tonight about 3 ways in which I think abortion, especially when made easily accessible by Roe v. Wade, has shaped the culture in which women and men find themselves today. So, my argument: easy abortion access, number one, increases sexual risk taking. Number two, relieves men of the responsibilities that accompany sex. And number three, creates disincentives for employers to accommodate caregiving and for the community at large to recognize it as the public good that it is. And all this harms the poor the most. So, my first way here is going to take up most of my time, but I think it's really essential to understanding what's going on here, especially as abortion rates actually begin to drop in certain jurisdictions. What I want to do is drill down on the kind of unquestioned assumption that the court made in Casey, I'm back on that other slide I'll refer to quite a bit, that the right to abortion helps women, quote, control their reproductive lives. So let's look at where we are today and some of the history of how we got here. So in 2020, we are now 60 years on from the release of the birth control pill and nearly 50 years on from Roe v. Wade. Yet studies continue to tell us that 45 to 50% of all pregnancies in the US are still unintended, a rate that is significantly higher, by the way, than other developed countries. Somewhere in the vicinity of half of all women who seek abortions report that they were using contraception the month they got pregnant. And it's no surprise that the unintended pregnancy rate for poor women is 5 times higher than for higher income women. Now, remember, when the FDA approved the birth control pill in 1960, the hope was that its widespread use would decrease unintended pregnancies and, at that time called out of wedlock, we call them now non-marital births, and also reduce the need that desperate women felt to procure abortions by then illegal means. This was Margaret Sanger's hope, and so the founding rationale of Planned Parenthood. At this point, I'm not going to complicate the story with the eugenics rationale underlying all this, except that I put a quote here up on the screen. Very happy to talk about that and how it kind of intersects with what I'll be talking about tonight in the Q&A. Though the pill was far more effective than its contraceptive peers, the fanfare surrounding its release seemed to promise too much. No method of birth control, save abstinence, was 100% effective in preventing pregnancy. Still, the pill served, as one political scientist put it, as a catalyst of rising expectations surrounding fertility regulation, even if, due to method and user failure rates, the pill and other available contraceptive methods on offer did not actually meet those expectations. In a word, the pill inspired a kind of misplaced confidence in sexual partners that their acts would be definitively sterile. So, what was the result of this newfound confidence in the efficacy of the pill among American women who by 1967 were consuming more than half of the world's hormonal contraceptives? In a word, more sexual risk taking, most notably outside of marriage. So, after 1960, you do not see the hoped for decline in non marital births or abortion. Rather, you see an increase in births outside of marriage, and so too single motherhood, as well as a growing trend in many states in the late 1960s to reform their abortion laws to provide for more access to legal abortion in some limited cases. So when Roe v. Wade comes down the pike in 1973, making abortion widely available by striking down every abortion law in the land, not only the strict 19th century laws, but also those reform measures of more recent vintage, sort of fought about in the late 1960s. Well, what happens? Well, the abortion rate surges, but so too does the non-marital birth rate. If the pill inspired a new kind of sexual risk taking, well, abortion on demand seemed to make things even worse. For the easy access to abortion that Roe granted did not just offer a strikingly inhumane remedy for contraceptive failure in individual cases. Rather, the abortion license actually tended to disincentivize contraceptive use. How so? Well, easy access to abortion, acting as a kind of secondary insurance to the primary insurance of contraception, provides, you could say, complete protection against the risk of childbearing. And complete protection against risk, economists tell us, tends to increase risk taking. We hear about this with, people going to doctors' offices and seatbelts and those types of things, but this is even true when it comes to sex. And this change in sexual behavior, in turn, Wellesley economist Philip Levine explains, increases the likelihood of abortion being needed. So this moral hazard effect of easy abortion was not lost on Alan Guttmacher, then president of Planned Parenthood, an organization that was then at this time devoted to contraception, not yet to abortion on demand. So he said in 1968, when an abortion is easily obtainable, contraception is neither actively nor diligently used. And here's Richard Posner in 1994, noted sort of law and economics guy who's actually a judge now, describing the sort of unintended consequences here. If abortion is cheap, intercourse will be more frequent and may generate more unwanted pregnancies, not all of which will be aborted. This should help us to understand the combination of cheap contraceptives, frequent abortion, and at a high rate of unwanted births in our society. And of course, the rate of non-marital births and abortion has increased most significantly over the last half century among poor women, for whom the attitudinal decoupling of sex and childbearing and marriage ushered in by this new sexual insurance scheme has been most acute. So this does not sound to me like a great advance in the ability of vulnerable women, especially, to, quote, control their reproductive lives. And according to this rather honest statement about contraceptive failure rates by the spokesperson for the largest abortion provider in the UK, throwing more and more contraception at the problem in an effort to prevent abortion, just as Margaret Sanger hoped, does not seem to solve the problem either. Unless, contra Miss Ferruti's position, perhaps abortion were less readily available as a kind of failsafe. So here I'm putting a bunch of economic studies, and I don't expect you to actually read them all, but I'll pull up the green one in a minute. Were abortion less accessible, economists suggest that contraceptive use and greater avoidance of sexual intercourse would actually increase, and that the rate of unintended pregnancy, abortion, and even single motherhood would likely decrease, though never to a vanishing point, of course. These economic theories detailed over the last couple of decades seem perhaps to be playing out in our day. So recent data has shown a decrease in the abortion rate beginning in the mid-1990s. Pro-lifers have credited legislative restrictions at the state level in the decades following Casey, that 1992 case that allowed for more state regulations. Pro-choicers have credited increased contraceptive use. While perhaps both are true, modest regulations on abortion have made abortion a bit more costly, so to speak, and therefore have created incentives toward more responsible sexual activity, including better contraceptive use and greater avoidance of sexual intercourse, both of which have been reported recently. Okay, so my second point follows readily from the first. Easy abortion access also relieves men of the responsibilities that accompany sex. Now, obviously, unintended pregnancy is an age-old issue, one which the purveyors of the pill, of course, hoped finally to solve, and one which I, too, hope to see more authentically managed. But what's important to see here is that the abortion-backed contraceptive revolution took sex far outside of the context in which unexpected pregnancy could be better received. Marriage, or at least a cultural expectation that the impregnating man had as much of a responsibility for the pregnancy as the pregnant woman. Now, this has never been a universal cultural expectation, of course. But women's rights advocates prior to the 1970s, beginning with Mary Wollstonecraft in the late 18th century, and then up through the 19th century women's movement in this country, argued for exactly this kind of solution. Just giving you a quick statement here from one of the resolutions from Seneca Falls. Wollstonecraft herself called men's, quote, want of chastity the, quote, grand source of women's immiseration. Yet this insight of Wollstonecraft and the 19th century women's rights advocates was this insight that men should join women at a higher standard of responsibility and care was abandoned just at that point in history, when women were gaining the kind of influence in both private and public spheres that could have made the expectation of male sexual integrity culturally normative. After all, the sexual insurance policy putatively taken out to insure both sexes against childbearing in reality insures primarily men, leaving women, especially poor women, worse off. Not only have sexual norms shifted away from the higher commitment sex that research continues to indicate is preferred by most women, but the increased rates of non-marital births and abortion that have accompanied the new sexual ethic disproportionately impact women. The now common mentality that sex has no consequences and thus entails no responsibilities often leaves women alone with their pregnancies to procure abortions or rear their children on their own, both of which portend various harms in themselves, especially for the poor. For although the connection between sexual intercourse and potential motherhood remains an unshakable biological reality for women, that's why we talk about abortion after all, the connection between sexual intercourse and potential fatherhood, that connection that irresponsible men have always sought to avoid, has withered even further since Roe. Planned Parenthood's Alan Guttmacher was again prescient in this regard. Abortion on demand relieves the man of all possible responsibility. He simply becomes a coital or sexual animal. Me too, anyone? Or as noted economists Janet Yellen and George Akerlof wrote in their famous 1996 paper, by making the birth of the child the physical choice of the mother, the sexual revolution has made marriage and child support a social choice of the father. And let us not forget that the leading predictor of poverty in the US is single motherhood. Now, make sure you understand me. This is not to blame single mothers. I was raised by one too. But it is to draw your attention to just who is being harmed by the new sexual ethic, one promoted by mainstream feminist organizations today. After all, college-educated women in this country are getting and staying married at the same rates as they were in the 1950s. So for all the talk of women's sexual autonomy in the feminist movement today, it is the highly educated women who have shorn autonomy, especially as they raise children, while poor women are left to experience the fallout of the sexual revolution by themselves. Okay, so on to my third point. The 1960s and 70s, and the early 70s at least, were decades awash in new questions that emerged with the revolutionary release of the birth control pill, as we've talked about, alongside women's increased social status and the unprecedented entry of mothers of young children into the workforce. As the then distinct women's movement and sexual revolution moved apace alongside one another, but not yet together, society had before it a newly emergent set of yet unforeseen and entangled questions. Number one, how to enable women to participate more fully in the public sphere. Number two, how to manage the significant technology shock, that's the language that Akerlof and Yellen use in their 1996 paper, created by the advent of the pill, which was effective, but again, not 100% so. And number three, how to maintain utmost societal concern for the perennial need to care for dependent children, who heretofore had been the primary responsibility of their mothers. So the court in Roe chose one definitive route, short-circuiting the impassioning debates going on across the country and state after state, with which Professor Williams talked a bit about in the last session, and thereby frustrating not only a better compromise among contending perspectives, it also thwarted more humane and cultural and kind of creative cultural responses to the asymmetries that naturally exist and socially persist due to women's disproportionate role in human reproduction. The court in 1992, here's that quote again, then doubled down on this particular response, explicitly arguing in Planned Parenthood versus Casey that over the intervening 19 years, the country and its actors had come to rely upon abortion for women's participation in public life. And here's another quote from Casey. And that's indeed what many employers and other institutions did. By relying on women's use of abortion, employers remained free to be unchanged by women's participation in them. And so, through women's legal right to abort their nascent children to participate in the market economy, women have learned to model themselves after the unencumbered men with whom they seek to compete. It's not hard to conclude that an unmitigated right to abortion serves a profit driven market above all else. So it's no wonder that as law and policy over the last several decades have elevated the rights of the unencumbered, autonomous individual above our common and shared responsibilities to the dependent, the weak, and the vulnerable, our workplaces have not grown much more hospitable to those who care for such persons. Indeed, given the centrality of the abortion rights in the feminist movement today, it's no surprise at all that work-family balance remains such a pressing issue facing women especially, and that it is women's status as mothers, no longer their status as women, that still causes the greatest inequities socially and professionally, despite remarkable gains to women overall. And these inequities strike working mothers who are raising children on their own most acutely. When we belittle the moral status of the unborn child here on the screen at about 8 weeks, treating the nascent human being in a near half century of Supreme Court case law as potential life, or in academic and popular arguments as something parasitic upon the pregnant woman, we ought not be surprised when our workplaces and other cultural institutions belittle dependent human beings and their caregivers too, whether that be through rampant pregnancy discrimination, inflexible work schedules, or a general inhospitality toward family responsibilities. And yet, without the court's intervention in Roe, but with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's commendable wins as an ACLU attorney in sex discrimination cases in the early 1970s, it seems to me that workplaces would have had to adjust much more quickly to encumbered women and duly encumbered men, and so to the demands of the child-rearing family more generally. So that gets me to the final part of my presentation tonight, a reproductive justice of a more authentic kind. For the question for a society that really cares about treating women, men, and children with justice and equal dignity, and supporting and encouraging the good use of all of their talents, is how we respond personally and culturally to the fact of sexual asymmetry, the ever apparent reproductive differences of the male and female bodies that are not going away. I think it's good to step back on occasion and think about the nature of reproductive asymmetry. Yes, the unequal burden on pregnant and caregiving women, but also the immense privilege. After all, the wondrous capacity to bear another human being in one's body and to suckle that child at one's breast too often goes unspoken today, as though to call attention to it would be to treat women as mere instruments, forgetting the subject who possesses this unique privilege or devaluing those who do not undertake it. Of course, contrary to bygone notions of earlier times, women's reproductive capacity does not impose upon each woman a general duty to bear children, nor does bearing children mean women are incapable of anything but, although I feel like I don't need to tell all of you at Notre Dame this these days, as though reproductive activities and professional ones are mutually exclusive. This is the egregious mistake rightly corrected by anti-discrimination law today. Pregnant women or those who are otherwise caring for children must not be assumed to be less competent or committed to their professional and other sort of work than their peers. But in shoring up respect for women as rational individuals and agents of their own lives, we best not make the contrary error. It's not sexist, or in legal parlance, sex stereotyping, to recognize the life-giving power women uniquely possess, nor to notice that sexual intercourse has the potential to transform intimate or casual partners into a biological mother and father. Given the stubborn sexual asymmetries that persist, despite decades of widely available contraception and abortion, it would be sexist indeed were we not to take due notice. I think when we open our eyes to the realities of sex for women, an intimate and embodied source of connectivity, and so not just for sport, It also helps us to see better the reality of pregnancy, the most intimate, embodied experience of connection, nurturance, and solidarity that human beings are capable of, and one that is enjoyed by women alone. And I think much of the data shows us that poor women tend to know this better than most. If pregnancy is likened, as it often is in our culture, to any other lifestyle choice, or consumer choice, or medical condition, or worse, a disability in a Hobbesian survival of the fittest against wombless men, pregnant women will never receive the cultural esteem and support they, in justice, are due. Rather, it is only by recognizing the inherent dignity of each human being, that moral proposition to which our country has ever been called, will pregnant women and caregiving families receive the public support and commendation they, in justice, deserve. For the cultural value of their caregiving depends unavoidably upon recognizing the incalculable value of the vulnerable and dependent human beings in their care. An authentic reproductive justice, then, would not only ask expectant mothers to offer their developing unborn child care that is due them, for pregnant and childbearing mothers to receive in justice the abundant care and support they need, fathers must take up their shared duties of care toward both mother and child too. For the single best response to the sexual asymmetries in both human reproduction and caregiving is an emotionally engaged and deeply attentive fatherhood. Such a fatherhood is most essentially one in which men who sire children recognize the distinctive and irreplaceable bonds they enjoy with them. But even more than that, it is the embrace of fatherhood as a core, constitutive, primary identity for men with children, one which prioritizes the collaborative, character shaping, solidarity building work of the home, and deeply respects the distinctive burdens and privileges women experience in childbearing and rearing, just as good men in generations past and present have always done. But for authentic reproductive justice to prevail in our time, more than that is needed still. It is high time that the work of the caregiving family be given the cultural respect, attention, and assistance it deserves. After all, the culturally essential duties of care and nurture undertaken in the home provide the very preconditions for just economic, political, and civil institutions. I believe it is only when we fully acknowledge this reality will it be possible to cogently and powerfully challenge the dominant capitalistic mentality that disfavors family obligation for both women and men. I think it would surely be difficult for feminist advocates of the 1990s to reimagine a women's movement without abortion rights at its very center. Those feminists remember a time when women were regarded as designed solely for domestic life, when women's opinions were undervalued, and when mothers were seen as more capable and essential to their children's upbringing than were fathers. For 1970s feminists, restrictions upon abortion betray precisely that vision of women, one that unfairly confines women solely to maternity, with no respect for their contributions beyond. But for those of us who grew up with the anti-discrimination gains of the 1970s securely in place, there is no question that women are as capable of educational and professional achievement as men. The questions have now become why the essential work of caring for dependents, still undertaken disproportionately by women, is not as esteemed and accommodated as it should be, and why poor women especially continue to be bereft of the paternal support both they and their children so heartily need. I think these are the questions a renewed women's movement must work to address. And rethinking the country's reliance on abortion as a privileged response to sexual asymmetry would be a good place to start. Really eager to hear from you all now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erica, for a wonderful and stimulating talk. This is excellent. We have about 25 minutes now for question and answer, and I will just say we've been having a lively side conversation on the chat about universal health care and abortion rates in European countries. So the question is if cheap and widely accessible abortion sort of leads to increase in abortion procurement, would that lead, say, in European countries where there is relatively easy access to abortion, to a rise in abortion in those countries? What might be the different factors in those countries that we should take into consideration when looking at those questions? Does universal health care play a role? Is there something else in those countries that um, that keeps abortion rates relatively stable?
Yes, thank you. Wonderful, really wonderful question. Thank you for it, because Europe's actually a great place to look. Because what we see in Europe, and actually my mentor, Marion Glendon, wrote a really important book called Abortion and Divorce in Western Law, I think in the late 80s, about this. And my book kind of updates some of her, my forthcoming books kind of updates some of her sort of insights and thinking about that. But what you see in what you see in our country with Roe v. Wade, and even with Planned Parenthood versus Casey, is widely available abortion. Now, with Casey, you've seen lots of state regulations in what we call red states. So certainly that availability of abortion has come down. And so abortion rates in those states have come down quite significantly. But in states where there's still widely available abortion in terms of abortion access and that type of thing, California, New York, my state of Massachusetts, you still see very, very high rates of abortion. What you see in European countries is not easy access to abortion, actually. Abortion is regulated quite a bit more in European countries. You see generally about limits, usually around 12 weeks. Sometimes in, I think Sweden has up to 16 weeks. But you also see the capacity, which we do not have because of our own jurisprudence, to put those sorts of limits. And what you see in our country actually is when you poll Americans, not when you ask them what do they think of Roe v. Wade, because generally people don't understand that Roe combined with the companion case of Doe v. Bolton allows for this sort of big kind of loophole in which you can have abortion all throughout the pregnancy if you wish in states, which is why you have such extensive abortion access within states like New York and California, et cetera. Our jurisprudence doesn't allow for restrictions that Americans would like to see. So when you poll Americans, what you see is basically what European countries have, which is restrictions on abortion until around 12 weeks. Allowance of abortion until 12 weeks and restrictions on abortion after 12 weeks. And that's generally, I mean, there's something like 70% of Americans, 60 to 70% of Americans who consistently poll that that's what they would like to see. The problem is that Roe and Casey don't allow us to get there. You would need to overturn Roe and Casey to allow states to begin to put, begin the legislative process, which again is the process that you've seen in European states. It's a legislative process. It's not a court imposed process. And I think that's actually why you see a lot less vitriol on this issue in European countries, because people have, through the democratic process, determined what they think their abortion laws should be. In conjunction, abortion, when limited, so Germany is a great example of this, in limiting its abortion to 10, 12 weeks, and even earlier in some cases, around the time we were passing or the court imposed Roe, you also see significant legislation in support of caregiving, which we also don't have in this country. So we just have pure libertarian view of abortion. So it's a private decision. And then if you choose to have a child, it's your private choice of childbearing. And whereas in the European context, which is more of a communitarian or a dignitarian context, you see it's a much more public understanding of childbearing because it's a public good. It's something that parents do for all of us, right? In terms of creating, future citizens and adding to the human community, inculcating virtue and values and all of that. It's a public good, something we do, and European countries understand that very well. So they have a much, a kind of a solution to the problem that I think is far, far better than the solution it hasn't been a solution because we've had this, animus about it, deep debate about it for the last 50 years.
So, as a follow up to that question, there's a question from Jane Peters. First, she says, "Thank you very much." And the question is sort of friends of various opinions on abortion have different policy views on how to execute care for vulnerable mothers, with generally left leaning friends and folks wanting federal government to supply help, and sort of right leaning folks wanting to assign this duty to private organizations, religious or otherwise. And it seems like a lot of that ideological clash depends on these policy views, especially when we look at the nuances in Americans' views on abortion. So the question is what do you think about the way forward, a political versus personal grassroots momentum?
Yes, another great question. So I think that there's all sorts of things. I mean, I think there's already lots of grassroots organizations who are doing great work to support mothers. I mentioned some at the beginning. Certainly, those should continue to grow. And I think that there's always room for government to kind of contract out that kind of work by providing funding and that type of thing. But I think it's really important to understand that the workplace, I mean, is one of the sort of, as I mentioned, the places where caregiving, where, it's sort of most inhospitable to caregiving because it's kind of the very site of the real capitalistic ethic, obviously, the real sort of profit making understanding of things where kind of cost benefit analysis is the way of kind of going and the bottom line, et cetera. So really the only force, big enough, strong enough to combat sort of that very strong force is, well, the government. And so I think it's really important that the government, whether it be state governments, but potentially the federal government too. I think when you see state governments doing this, that parenthetically, I'll say it's very helpful because as sort of experiments in democracy, you could say they can try sort of different things, and we can see where women are cared for the most, and where families are supported. But I think there's got to be a way to sort of incentivize or create requirements on employers in all sorts of different ways. So I think that you can, look at for poor especially, we have this real what scholars have called just-in-time scheduling, real inflexible scheduling in their work. And so it's ridiculous. They sometimes, you hear sort of these horror stories of women literally giving birth and needing to be at work within the same week, where people, can't get away for doctor's appointments, where people, can't get, their jobs covered and they're at risk of losing their jobs because of, potential daycare falling through and that type of thing. So there's certainly like predictable scheduling, understandings of the flexibility. So lots and lots of, high income earners have very, very flexible work. And so they can go see soccer games, they can go to doctor's appointments, they can take time off. That sort of flexibility needs to be something that is present in wage earning work. And the kind of predictable scheduling, it needs to be something that happens. And so those kinds of policies need to come directly from the government. I think something like part-time pay equity, where, if you go part-time, you're not paid disproportionately less than your full-time peers if you're getting your part-time work done. Because a lot of women and potentially men want to, assume some sort of part-time work. And obviously, things like telecommuting, all those things are helpful. But I think there's got to be ways in which exiting and entering the workforce because of caregiving is not, you're not sort of penalized because of care, but it sort of becomes, something that people see as something where you bring something better into the workforce because of, the dedicated time you spend on care. That is not the way we think about it. And so, yes, there are ways in which government needs to, sort of present just like European countries have. And it doesn't mean shelling out piles of money, although I'm in favor of some sort of, I'm not so much in favor, but I'd like to see studied some sort of family allowance, or buffing up like tax credits, child tax credits and that type of thing. I mean, there's all sorts of debates about this going on. And I think it's really important, and conservatives have started to see it's really important. for the government to make the country and the workplace more hospitable for caregiving. It's the just thing, and it's crazy to think that you would do any otherwise, because as I kind of mentioned at the end of my talk, every economic, political, and civil good rests upon the preconditions of the care work done in the home. So to ignore that, to think it's less important than work that's done for a wage, is ridiculous. And so really, I think that both sides, and certainly, I'm in contact with many people who are pro-choice, who want to be talking about these sorts of things, about promoting and supporting care work, because I think both sides see it to be really, really an urgent task, that we kind of have to catch up here.
Our next question is from Christy, and she asks why the rate of unintended pregnancy is so much higher among poor women, and why in general the consequences of the sexual revolution have fallen most heavily upon this group. Would love to hear your analysis of those questions.
So I was trying to do that during the whole talk. That was sort of what I was trying to get at, because I think, think about when you set up sort of abortion as a solution for the poor. And so we see this as just part and parcel of what's done in poor communities in terms of having Planned Parenthoods far more available. I'll give you sort of a story of how I came to this. I was actually at Middlebury College. I was one of the leaders of my women's center. It was then called the Women's Center. I suspect it's called the Gender Center or something now. But I was a women's studies student, and I was an avid pro-choice advocate. And I went down to Washington, D.C. for a semester rather than going abroad, because I was really interested in sort of political questions. And I was working on welfare reform. It was in during it was the Clinton years, when both Republicans and Democrats were coming together to sort of work on welfare reform. And what I couldn't get out of my sort of sight was how those people with whom I generally agreed, which was the people on the left — I called myself at that point a socialist feminist — were so insistent on abortion, more and more and more abortion for the poor. Like, this was the way that they — and it's not to say that they didn't also support good welfare and those types of things, but abortion access was so central to this. And I kept sort of thinking, and at the same time I was reading Marianne Glendon's book, Rights Talk, which, and she kind of talks about how we tend to, in our country, for all the reasons I mentioned in response to the first question, we tend to kind of give women her right to autonomy, her right to abortion, and kind of, leave them alone with that. We don't give them other support. And so I kind of had this vision of that, like, we're trying to abort poverty out of its existence. Now, obviously, that is not what, pro-choicers would ever at all think that they were trying to do. But you can't help but see that when, after Sanger and the abortion, before, women's rights advocates came on board, it was the population controllers who were most intent on seeing more abortion laws. And part of it was this eugenic rationale, was because they saw the uptick in out of wedlock births among the poor. And so they wanted to have a solution, because clearly getting them contraception, which was Sanger's intent, was to get the poor contraception, because we couldn't have so many of the children of the poor. And so she set up clinics in poor neighborhoods and that type of thing. Well, then it becomes, well, contraception isn't kind of doing what we want because of this increase in sexual risk taking. So we'll put, now we need to use abortion. And actually, I have a good slide on that. But anyway, but the point being is that when you combine this, contraception or abortion-backed contraception as the solution, and you don't offer what actually Sanger called palliatives, so things that we now would refer to like that we think would help the poor. So the things I mentioned during the last question, or as we were talking about healthcare, housing, education, all those types of things, she actually referred to those as palliatives. She was, working around the same time as the suffragists, and she called suffrage a palliative. That is something that just kind of, is sort of a nice band-aid, but doesn't get at the real crux, which is women's fertility. And that's the real problem. She even called it a duty. Women have sort of brought upon this misery themselves, and they have a duty to contracept. And so, I think when you have all of that in the mix, you start to see the kind of moral hazard that I'm talking about that increases the unintended rate among the poor. What's fascinating though is that poor women do not though they have the highest percentage of abortions because their unintended pregnancy rate is so much higher than the more well off. They only access abortion. I think it's something like I was reading today, and I think I didn't double check the stats, but in a paper by Richard Reeves, who's at Brookings Institution, that poor women get abortion at 9% of the time they go for abortion, whereas women who are have unexpected pregnancies who are more well off access abortion 30% of the time. And so what's that all about? And so, we're trying to say like we should give them more contraception, more abortion, but what we've seen, ethnographers in a great book called Promises I Can Keep, poor women want to have babies. They want to have children. And so it's helping them to find ways to support that, but also I would hope connecting the fathers of those children to those children, not only because those children really thrive with their fathers in their lives, but it makes it a heck of a lot easier to be a mother to children when the father is involved in those children's lives.
There's a question from Mary who would like to know if you would recommend a good resource to learn more about Roe and Casey and our limits on abortion as opposed to European countries.
Yeah, so I would definitely go back to Marion Glendon's book, Abortion and Divorce in Western Law. I would then also wait for my book, which is coming out of Notre Dame Press in July. So if you can hold on for a little while. I also have written a couple of law review articles that may be helpful. They don't directly compare Western countries, but you could go and do quick searches to understand the kind of limitations that are put on abortion in Western Europe as compared to our country. So again, I mean, since Casey, there are limitations that are put that are not limitations on the right itself. So there's like waiting periods, there's parental notification laws, there's ultrasound requirements and those types of things in most of the red states. But there aren't restrictions on abortion. There have been 20-week restrictions put on that haven't been, there's no litigation around that, though that doesn't seem to be something that is permissible in terms of current law because of viability and that type of thing. Obviously, there are some red states who have, in very, very recent years, in the last, year or two, have restricted abortion. And of course, those are all being litigated right now because there's nothing in Roe or Casey that has allowed that kind of restriction. So there's obviously in really red states, deep red states, there's restrictions up to like 6 weeks. So there are, of course, I should correct myself to say there are state laws that are restricting abortion. Roe and Casey don't allow those. So those cases are definitely coming up to the Supreme Court soon, and it'll be interesting. Generally, I think that the court hasn't granted cert on any of them yet. So we'll see, or maybe they have. I'm not aware of that actually. But we will be seeing those types of things come to the Supreme Court soon.
So for our last question comes from Destiny, and she asks, how do we organize and build power within the pro-life movement to push for some of these types of practical changes that you've been talking about, these policy and law-based changes?
Power in the pro-life movement. I wonder if that's my friend Destiny. And by the way, Jess, I've had this happen before where I see that there's more questions up there and then they get deleted. I would love to see those. And anyone who's had questions that I haven't been able to answer because now time's short, feel free to contact me via email or something like that. I'd be happy to talk with you. So I think this is a good question. I think the good news is that I'm just actually starting to work. There's many, many people who are interested in this kind of thing, right? You're already seeing a lot of, look at someone like Marco Rubio, who has immense, well, of course, he didn't get the nomination for the Republican Party the last go around, but he is one of the people who's, pushing forward, sort of care legislation. And one hopes that if they can get it right, especially if Biden becomes president, maybe if Trump remains president, that we can start to see more of this kind of care legislation at the federal level. But I think at the state level, that's where I'm eager to start seeing, especially red states, if they're gonna, be restricting abortion, they darn well better be providing these sorts of protections and supports for women. So I'm actually gathering together a very small group of people who will be working on that soon, and hopefully we'll start to see more that happening. I mean, I think enough of us have started to get some more attention. I think to see that there needs to be. I mean, Marion Glennon was talking about this for decades. She was part of something called the communitarian movement. Look that up. That's actually when I was in college at Middlebury. The communitarian movement was all the rage. It was a bipartisan group of people who are really involved and interested in these kinds of questions, not about abortion so much, but just about how to build up sort of those institutions that were sort of being pulled down by, whether it's the free market or other sorts of things. So obviously, family structures, neighborhoods, especially neighborhoods, because we need good neighbors. And the poor need good neighbors. They need good neighborhoods. They need jobs in those neighborhoods. They need people willing to go into those neighborhoods to look at the work of David and Amber Lapp, who have done so much great work with working class populations, have moved into that neighborhood themselves. There needs to be more people like that, so we can shore up neighborhoods and bring kind of a listening ear to neighborhoods so we can understand really what's needed instead of looking in from without. Those kind of ethnographer kind of work is really important to really understand what really is necessary. I also just want to make a plug for this really awesome, I think, totally cutting edge podcast. And I can't remember exactly what the podcast is, but if you look up Babies at Work, it's a couple, both a tech company and a manufacturing company, who have found ways to allow babies to come to work with their parents. And one of the greatest quotes of this, and I could see this happening on college campuses with professors, but also just to see it happening all in the manufacturing realm. You could see it happening in stores. I mean, I don't see why this couldn't happen in shops, where babies are at work, in their slings or whatever. And one of the greatest quotes, and then I'll end with this, is that there's like a clamoring among the other people in the workplace to get to be the baby holder when the parents have, urgent things that they need to do where they can't have the baby there. Obviously, if there's a colicky baby, then it doesn't work, but most babies just want to be with their parents. So anyway, I would look up, try to find, I think it's like, I can't remember where it is, but if you find Babies at Work, if you can't find it and you're like eager to see this really cool cutting edge tech, this is what happens when more and more women become like higher in companies, I think, but also family oriented men. You start to see this change, and it's your generation who's going to do this. I'm just confident about that. So thank you all.
Well, that brings us to the end of the hour, friends. And though we may be virtual, our gratitude is not. Thank you very much, Erica, for spending this time with us. This was just a wonderful presentation, and we're so grateful for your time. And thank you to all of you for joining us, taking an hour out of your day. Please sign up for our next session on November 11th. And until then, have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you soon. Good night, everyone.